This happened 3 years ago when my twin brother and I were 15. Our bedrooms are right next to each other on the bottom floor of the house, while my parents' master bedroom is on the second floor. One night, I woke up to some commotion going on in my brother's bedroom. I sat up in bed, and a minute after I sat up, my mom walked by with my brother, and it sounded like they were arguing. My brother has nightmares often, and this night he claimed he saw someone looking through his window at him. He grabbed his cell phone and called my mom as the stranger stood there. While telling her what was happening, I guess the person disappeared right before she got to his room. My mom had a feeling he was just having a nightmare, but he insisted he was awake and that there was someone outside. My dad investigated, and there was no one out there. This happened another time, a few nights later, but this time, I was awoken abruptly by my brother entering my room in a panic. I asked him what the hell he was doing, irritated, and he was almost in tears and said, "That guy is back. He's outside my window." The tone of his voice. Suddenly I felt a chill come over me. I knew he wasn't dreaming or having a nightmare. We sat in my dark bedroom, and before we had a chance to think of what to do next, we heard a thump on the wall. My bed is pressed up against the wall, and on the other side was my brother's bedroom. He looked at me in terror. I was rapidly trying to make sense of what was happening before we heard a second, louder thump. We sat in disbelief, and a minute later, my phone started ringing. It scared the hell out of us. I silenced the noise, but didn't answer the call. It was my brother calling. I looked up at him in horror and confusion and showed him the screen of my phone. His eyes became wide, and he started to tremble. I rejected the call and immediately called my dad. He answered in a tired voice, and I told him someone was in the house. He asked me what I was talking about, not wanting to believe that what I just said was a reality. I told him again, and then heard him promptly come down the stairs, fast. He opened my bedroom door, and my brother and I told him that just a few feet away from where he stood, in my brother's bedroom, was an intruder. My dad has never been faced with anything like this, so I could tell he was scared when he realized he had to go check it out. My brother and I followed closely behind him. The window was open, and my brother's cell phone was lying on the ground in the middle of the floor. We installed cameras around the house the next day, but whoever it was hasn't returned since. We think whoever it was that was in my brother's room must have seen us installing the cameras. When I was in my teens, my parents took a vacation but left their cars in the driveway. It was just my grandmother who lived in our house, my younger sister, and myself for almost 2 weeks. One random night, I woke up to our dog growling and the motion sensor lights in our backyard turning on. I got up and walked towards the front of the house and noticed a shadow coming through the bottom of the door crack. Somebody was standing there. I slowly creeped my way to the peephole, and when I looked out, I saw an eyeball looking in. I froze for a second in a panic and then rushed to the phone to call 911. As I was running away from the door, the person did one really loud slam on the front door and gave off a laugh that I can only describe as absolutely insane. As I'm calling the police, I run to one of the windows to see if I can see what the person looks like, and I notice an old car speeding off down the street. I never knew who it was or why they were there. The police believed that it was burglars thinking nobody had been in the house because the cars hadn't moved in days. I was home alone for a weekend a few years ago while I was still in high school. After school one day, I was driving home, and when I passed in front of my house, I thought I saw an old lady in white clothes in my sister's bedroom looking through the window. I went into the house and slowly went to her bedroom to check it out, but there was no one there. I pretty much forgot about it until that night I got a call from a very panicked and scared neighbor saying that there was some lady pacing back and forth in my sister's bedroom. I ran to the room to check again, but there was no one there. Nothing like this has happened since. I hadn't known Clara long, but we were inseparable as soon as we were introduced. I could tell her anything, and she accepted me for who I was, instead of politely tolerating me like the others. My birthday party was modestly attended by my classmates. Either their parents forced them to come, or they felt bad for me. I only cared that Clara was there, and I ignored the other guests. They played amongst themselves, as Clara and I drank tea, ate cake, and laughed together. She told the best jokes. She was in the middle of a really funny story when Daddy grabbed her and dragged her across the lawn. The other children cheered as Daddy slipped a noose on Clara and threw the other end of the rope over a tree branch. The noose tightened around her delicate neck as he pulled on the rope, lifting her and causing her legs to dangle in the air. I'll never forget her writhing and reaching, or the sound of her trying to choke out my name from her collapsing throat. The whole party was a setup, some sick joke that everyone was playing on me. I ran to Daddy and tugged on his pant leg and begged him to stop. I begged him to let Clara go before she choked to death. I begged and begged, but instead, Daddy grinned and yanked the rope, causing her body to bob in the air. He tousled my hair and then handed me a baseball bat. He wanted me to beat Clara while she was hanging and barely holding on to her life. He wanted me to beat her as her eyes bugged out and her face turned blue. He wanted me to beat her as the noose cut into the skin around her throat, causing it to peel and bruise. Daddy put his strong hands on my arms and positioned me into a batter's stance. "Go on, honey. Don't be afraid," he whispered in my ear. "Give her a whack." I stood frozen as the children around me started yelling, becoming more and more impatient. The world spun around and I dropped the bat. The other children became enraged until Daddy picked it up and smashed it into Clara's dangling body. The fear in her eyes increased as he pummeled her again and again, leaving bruises and breaking her limbs, causing her bones to jut out of her skin. The final blow split her open and her guts spilled out all over the lawn. My classmates squealed in delight as they rushed to grab her entrails. They shoved her innards into their greedy mouths and licked their lips, now red and sticky with her blood. Daddy left her lifeless body hanging for the rest of the party. I begged him to call the doctor, but he scoffed and said the doctor won't help. At the end of the day, Daddy threw Clara into the kitchen trash can. Every time I snuck her into my room, he took her away and put her back into the trash. For 5 days I stared at her rotting body while I ate my morning cereal and my microwave dinner. Then the garbage men came. They took her away. They took her away forever. I hope you understand now. I simply can't get rid of my newspapers or my old magazines. I know I haven't painted or sewn for years, but I need to keep those art supplies and fabric, just in case, and I can't part with my glass bottle collection. Some of them are very rare, original green glass. They might be worth something one day. I know the dining room table is far too big for the room, but it was such a good deal, and my chairs were my aunt's. No pets? No, I could never bear to part with any of them. 26 cats and 40 rabbits may seem like a lot, but I love each and every one of them. I can even name them all. Clarence, Tommy, Melanie. Well, she's been missing for a few years. Maxwell. Or is it Maxine? They're happy here. Very happy. Please don't take them away from me. Please, don't take anything. It's all I have. From about 5th to ninth grade, my best friend Natalie and I were pretty much inseparable. We lived only a few streets away from each other in an idyllic little town in the Midwest. The kind of place that feels like a living time capsule of the 1950s. Charming houses with beautifully kept gardens. Huge old maple and oak trees lining every street. Neighbors who actually stop and greet each other as they walk their dogs or mow their lawns. Summer block parties. Kids playing in the street until dinner time. That sort of thing. Natalie and I used to walk to and from school together every day, and I often stayed over at her house for an hour or two after school while my parents were still at work. I loved hanging out at her place because her mom was the sweetest person ever. She would serve us delicious snacks, we would tell her all about the latest middle school drama, and she'd even let us watch a TV show or play a computer game before we started our homework. Natalie's dad worked a lot and wasn't around often, but whenever I did interact with him, something about him seemed off. On a superficial level, he was perfectly nice and friendly, even funny. He had a great sense of humor and was always joking around with Natalie and me, and the rest of our friends on the few occasions that he was around. But even though I didn't sense a single bit of discomfort from any of my close friends, I couldn't help feeling uneasy in his presence. For one thing, he was a bit too touchy-feely. It was subtle, but I was always noticing in little ways that made me slightly uncomfortable. Here's an example. One weekend, he took me and Natalie and two of our friends to a cider mill. We picked apples, drank cider, and went on a hayride. When the ride was over, Natalie's dad was helping each of us off the side of the wagon, and I was last in line. Something about the way he grabbed my friends by the waist and let his hands linger just a touch too long once they were safely on the ground started to weird me out. When it was my turn, I quickly jumped off the wagon before he could touch me. He looked a little bewildered, but didn't say anything. Fast forward to Natalie's 12th birthday party. She had a sleepover with about 10 girls, and we arranged our sleeping bags on the floor of her living room, since it was the biggest room in the house. The living room wasn't really closed off by any doors. It had a big opening that connected it seamlessly with the foyer and the front hallway of the house. I was sleeping near that hallway, which I wasn't pleased about, as I preferred to sleep surrounded by people whenever I went to sleepovers. I've always been super afraid of the dark and liked having that extra protection, as silly as it sounds. In the middle of the night, I'm awoken by a hand pressing on my arm. I didn't jolt awake or anything, but I opened my eyes and turned my head to survey my fellow partygoers. They were all dead asleep, some even lightly snoring. Suddenly I heard quiet giggling behind me. Still lying down, and now officially frightened, I quickly turned my body to face the foyer. The opening in the wall that connected the living room and the foyer was a big, sweeping arch. On the right side of the arch, I could just barely see the top of a man's head peeking out from behind the wall, only about 3 feet from the ground. Then I noticed his fingertips were spread out on the wooden floor. He was crouching. It was Natalie's dad. I froze. I honestly had no idea what to do. Was he just kidding around? Didn't it occur to him how creepy this was? Do I say something or just awkwardly ignore it and try to fall back asleep? Being my timid, non-confrontational preteen self, I decided to go the latter route. I turned back on my other side, scooted in as close as I could to my friend sleeping next to me, and somehow managed to fall back asleep, despite being obviously and understandably petrified. I'm not sure how long it was before I was woken up again, this time by a firm tapping on my temple. Knowing who it was this time around, I tried my best not to indicate that I was awake, struggling to keep my eyes closed and my breathing slow and deep. Again, I heard the same stifled giggling. The sound was particularly disturbing because it was almost manic, like he thought this whole routine was absolutely hilarious and could barely contain himself. even though it was coming from a grown man. It had all the giddiness of a 5-year-old playing hide-and-go-seek with his older siblings. Yet again, I had no idea what to do. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to acknowledge him or what. I turned to face the foyer again and just barely caught a glimpse of his head and fingers, disappearing behind the wall in that same crouched position. More giggling. I quickly turned back and scooted even closer into my sleeping friend, partially waking her and causing her to shift around a bit. I hoped that she would wake up completely, but she just turned over and quickly drifted back off. As I pulled my sleeping bag tighter over my shoulders, I heard what sounded like someone shuffling on all fours down the hallway. I don't remember how I got back to sleep that night, but I somehow did, and morning finally, mercifully, arrived. Natalie's parents made all of us pancakes, and her dad was acting completely normal. He didn't pay any particular attention to me, but didn't make a point to ignore me either. Just interacted with me like he did with everyone else, always smiling and joking and friendly. A couple months later, Natalie had another sleepover. This time, I made sure to secure a sleeping spot in the exact center of everyone, far from the front hallway. But later that night, I abruptly woke up in the middle of a deep sleep for seemingly no reason. I had been sleeping on my back and just suddenly opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, wide awake. Almost instantly, I was overcome with the most intense feeling of dread that I have ever experienced. I felt like I couldn't move my limbs, like some invisible weighted blanket was holding my body down. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I slowly turned my head towards the front hallway. As my eyes adjusted in the darkness, I could see Natalie's dad and mom standing in the entryway, looking directly at me with the most angry, hateful expressions on their faces. They were positioned awkwardly far from each other, about 2 feet of space between them, with their arms stiff and straight at their sides. Even though they were a fair distance away from me, I'll never forget how disturbing their faces looked, contorted into pure rage that only seemed to grow in intensity the longer I allowed myself to look. Their eyes kept narrowing, and they were showing all their teeth the way a threatened dog would, gritting them so tightly I thought their jaws would crack. After staring, frozen, for a good few seconds, I finally felt like I could move my arms and legs again. I quickly turned away from them and pulled my sleeping bag high up over my head, shaking. I barely slept the rest of the night, but I never heard any noise or movement from the hallway. The next morning, it was all homemade pancakes and warm smiles and utter normalcy yet again. I never told Natalie about any of this, as I was pretty sure she would think I was either crazy or trying to prank her. Our friendship quickly faded a few years later anyway, which coincidentally was right around the time that her parents got divorced. Recently, Natalie and her parents' divorce came up in conversation with my mom, who told me about a comment Natalie's mom made to her years ago. Back when Natalie and I were still super close, we had actually taken a few small road trip vacations together with our moms. I guess at some point on one of these trips, our moms were gossiping about a particularly wealthy and impossibly perfect family that lived in our neighborhood and had a reputation of being somewhat pretentious. Natalie's mom, skeptical about their apparent perfection, said, "Well, in this neighborhood, you never know what goes on behind closed doors." The comment is innocent enough, but for me, it adds an extra layer of creepiness given what I experienced with Natalie's parents. It happened during my freshman year of college, when I was back in my hometown for Thanksgiving break. I'm from a small town in New England, the kind of place you can't wait to get away from, because nothing ever happens there. I guess maybe this was my town's way of getting back at me for thinking like that. It was late on a Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I was at a friend's house, happily reunited with my best friends from high school since we were all home for the holiday. A fog settled in that night, owing to the classic New England mix of chill and humidity. As I drove home, I went by our town's library, which is situated next to a small duck pond. The fog was extra thick over the water and illuminated by the lampposts surrounding the pond. It gave it an eerie golden glow. Being the film student that I was, I had my camera with me as always. Without thinking, I turned my car around and pulled into the library parking lot, which overlooked the pond. I considered walking down to the pond for a moment, but something told me not to do that. It wasn't fear, not yet. I remember not feeling any fear at all, just excitement and awe of the sight in front of me. But still, I didn't get out of my car, and that decision probably saved my life. Instead, I kept my car running, headlights still on, and rolled down my window. I stuck my arm out of the window and took a few photos of the pond and the fog. I pulled my arm back inside and looked over the photos. They were pretty terrible given how bad of a technique I was using. This was the first time something felt wrong. As I looked at the photos, I just felt, the best way I can think to explain it is that sometimes I have nightmares about being in open water. I know that there are sharks swimming beneath me. I can't see them, but I know they're there. I realized I was having that same feeling in my waking life as I looked through these pictures. I felt the danger before I saw it. I looked up from my camera, fully alert, and peered in front of me, but saw nothing for a moment. Then, a figure materialized out of the darkness, around the pond, and into the beams of my headlights. It was a man. He was wearing dark jeans and a black zip-up jacket. His hair was dark and short. I don't remember his face. He was walking in the direction of the library, in the direction of my car. I waited, not wanting to let my fear take over. Maybe he wasn't walking toward me. Maybe he was going to the road. But he kept coming toward me, walking faster and getting closer. I remembered my window was down and quickly rolled it up. Then he was right in front of the hood of my car, and I could tell beyond a shadow of a doubt he was staring straight at me. The look in his eyes. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were intent, determined. The moment we made eye contact, the moment I saw that look, I just reacted. I don't remember feeling fear or panic, just being more alert than I have ever been. I never took my eyes off of the man as I threw my car into reverse and spun out of the parking spot I was in. But I went the wrong way. Instead of turning my car towards the exit, I turned toward the back parking lot. Yes, there was another exit I could get to, but I would have to drive around the entire library to get there. Either that or reverse all the way out onto the road and risk hitting something. A tree, another car. I didn't want to risk crashing. Then I'd have no escape. I decided I would have to go around the library. It would take longer, but it was the safest option. All these thoughts went through my head in an instant. The man ran to get in front of my car. One of my biggest regrets in life is not running him over then and there. I put my car in drive and waited. He stopped running once he was in front of the car and then took his time. He walked slowly around the hood of my car, staring at me the whole time. Our eyes followed each other. He smiled. The moment he was clear of the front of my car, two things happened. He lunged for my car door. I floored it. I remember the sight of my car sailing past his outstretched hand. I drove as fast as I've ever driven, taking the corners at speed around the library. As I came out the other side, the exit was in sight, but the man wasn't. I drove as fast as I could toward the exit. As I got in front of the library again, I looked over and saw the man running as fast as he could to get to my car. I sped out of the library parking lot and onto the main road. The police station was a block away, and I made a beeline for it, still driving recklessly fast, hoping to be pulled over by a cop. I got to the police station, and that's when the fear finally settled in. I sat in my car and cried, breathing raggedly, completely frozen. I couldn't get out of my car. I was terrified that the man had followed me there, that as soon as I got out of the car, he would get me. A police officer came out to my car and escorted me inside. They must have seen me on their security cameras. I spoke with a female sergeant. I told her what happened, gave her the best description I could. They immediately sent cars out, but found no one. I assumed that the man was after my car, my camera maybe, and said that out loud. The female sergeant looked at me and shook her head. What she told me, I'll never forget. I don't think he was after your car or your camera. He was after you. When I was 16, I would sneak out of the house at night to get high and read a book. There was an empty foreclosed home next door, and I would get inside via a basement window and smoke in the basement's bar area. One night, it was raining pretty heavy, and I forgot to bring my lighter. I went to get it, and it was still pouring when I got back. I set up a comfy place at the bar and turned on my camping lamp that I kept there. Then I started hearing noises upstairs. I turned off the light and sat still for a moment, and realized the sound was actually coming from the doorless room right next to me. I grabbed everything I could and made for the window, and with half my body through, I heard someone running and shouting behind me. I felt someone touch me as I finished crawling out, and ran to my house, where I snuck in as quietly and as fast as possible. I heard sirens soon after I made it into my house, and worried that it was law enforcement that had caught me in the home. Sirens went on for a while into the night, and I barely slept. I learned the next morning that someone on the next block had burned his mother's home down, with her in it, and he had been found breaking into a home later that night that was occupied several doors past the house I had been in. It was likely him that was in the basement with me, and I still get scared thinking about it. Growing up, my parents added onto our house, and my bedroom was the only one upstairs. My sister and I had shared a room at one point, and are still to this day extraordinarily close, so it wasn't uncommon for her to wander into my room and sleep in my bed, or vice versa. I woke up in the middle of the night one time to see a hand scrambling around between the edge of my bed and the wall. I immediately assumed that my sister had slept in my bed and had fallen off the edge. The hand was grasping the side of the bed and reaching like it was trying to grab something desperately in a blind panic. Thinking my sister needed help, I looked over the edge of the bed, and there was nothing there. I scurried down the stairs and slept in my sister's room that night, where she was sleeping peacefully without incident. Over the summer, I took my son and his friend on a ride at the local fair. My son has Down syndrome, which is relevant to the story in that he doesn't have the sort of fantastical imagination of his peers. Said differently, he doesn't make things up. As we were sitting, waiting for the attendant to buckle everyone in, my son hit himself. This is not at all normal behavior. So I said, "What are you doing?" He replied, "John told me to." I asked him, "Who is John?" We are literally locked and loaded into a spinning something of death ride. He replies, pointing in front of us, "John and Stephen, the guys standing in front of us with ketchup all over their face." No one was standing there. He has never mentioned them or done anything like this since. When I was in college, I made some money by modeling, sometimes just letting photography students take pictures of me for practice. Other times, I'd work with professionals on fetish shoots. One day, I saw an ad on Craigslist. Standard creepy Craigslist deal. Amateur male photographer seeking woman willing to pose nude for him to practice his art and also add to his private collection. It was summer, and my jobs on campus had dwindled down to nearly nothing. I needed money, bad, so I replied to this very sketchy ad. The guy wanted me to take a bus to the big city, several hours away from the small town where I went to college. Then, I would meet him at his studio, and I would be paid $200 to model for him. He said I could bring a male friend for safety. He was not expecting anything more than modeling. He promised. It would be okay. He was a normal man in his 40s with a professional job, a doctor, and he just wanted more practice at his hobby. I'm desperate to make rent. I say sure. We set a day. The day of, he emails me to be sure that I'm coming alone. I say no, I'm bringing my friend as we agreed. At this point, the emails are getting weird. I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach that things are not okay with this guy. I stopped replying to the emails and obviously did not attempt to go to the gig. Life went on. 2 years later, I'm living in another state, but just happened to see a news story on Facebook. It was about a trial. A professional man, a doctor in his 40s, was on trial in the big city for murdering a woman who had answered his ad for a nude model. He had murdered her in a horrible way. Based on details from news stories, I am certain it was the same ad I had seen, the same man I had emailed, the gig that I had almost taken. My mother's family lived on the second floor of a large duplex. The front doors to the second floor apartments were located on the side of the buildings and faced each other from one duplex to the other. They rarely locked the front door, and everyone knew their neighbors quite well. One morning, one of my uncles, who must have been about 13 at the time, says he woke up very early. This was summertime, and although it was kind of light out, the sun hadn't risen yet, so it was practically in the middle of the night still. He was half awake in his bed, a bit groggy, and he realized that what had woken him was the sound of someone creeping along in the corridor. For some reason, it didn't feel right to him. It didn't sound like someone from the family was going to the bathroom during the night. It was slower. He called out, "Hey, who's there?" He then heard whoever was in the corridor walk back to the top of the stairs, down the stairs, and then out the front door. Creepy enough in my opinion, but it gets much worse. Within 6 months of this happening, a teenage girl was found dead in the duplex next door to my family's home. She had been killed during the night with a hammer by a 15-year-old boy that lived nearby. He was known by all the other kids of the neighborhood, and my mother remembers him as being very quiet and always kind of looking down or away whenever you would look at him. He was kind of an outcast, certainly because of his personality, but also a bit perhaps because he went to a posh school thanks to his father being the janitor there, and he got a bit snobbed out by the other kids. In the duplex where my family lived, on the first floor there was a family with 3 teenage girls. In my family, there were 2 teenage girls. I guess he knew where to look, and I guess he must have been lurking around for a good while before deciding that it was time to take the hammer out. He killed himself while in a hospital, while he was still very young. When my friend was about 11 or 12 years old, she went to an all-inclusive resort with her family. This was one of those big places with several pools, restaurants, kids areas, etc. Her dad buys walkie-talkies, one for her brother, and one for the adults. This was before cell phones were a big thing, so that they can stay in touch if the kids want to do their own thing. One night, her parents and her brother go down to the restaurant for dinner. My friend isn't feeling well, so she asks to stay in the hotel room and watch a movie. They agree, giving her the walkie-talkie for emergencies. She's up there for an hour or so, checking in periodically with her dad, just to say hi or ask what they're doing. She starts to feel really sick and says to her dad, "Hey, when do you think you'll be back to the room?" Her dad answers back, "We're coming up right now, sweetie. I forgot the room number. Could you tell me what it is again?" As soon as she's about to answer, her dad's voice cuts in. "Hey, we're coming up right now. We brought you some cake. We'll see you in 5. She knows that the second voice was her dad. She locks the door. When her parents get back, they say they haven't talked to her all night. We were camping once, driving through some city. My dad was driving and my mom was in the passenger seat. I was in the back. It was evening, but not fully dark. We weren't really talking, and my mom was looking out her window when she says, "Oh my God, oh my God, do you see it?" My dad says, "Yeah, I do. I'm gonna slow down and let them pass." He slowed, and the car on the right passed us. I couldn't see inside, but their window was down, and the arm hanging out the window looked to be that of someone impossibly thin. I asked my mom what she saw, and she said it was nothing. My dad backed her up. Years later, I asked them about it again. My mom said, "It was a skeleton. It was no mask, because you could see through the jaws. It had a tongue and eyes." My dad backed her up again, but years later, after my mom was dead, he recanted, saying that it must have been a mask, because nobody could be alive and look like that. A couple of years ago, I was living in Budapest. It was half study abroad, half hanging out with my family, who lived in a town about 30 minutes south. Every once in a while I would take day trips with my friends, so on one of our trips to Romania, our car broke down on us right at the border. One of my friends had family that wasn't too far away, but way too far to walk, so the 4 of us decided to hitchhike. We grabbed what we could out of the car and then called her family to tell them that we were on the way. We locked up the car and made a sign that said we were hitchhiking. About 5 minutes later, a van pulled over and we got inside. The guy who picked us up, Andreas, was very nice. He was very interested in where we were all from, what we liked to do, where we've traveled, and what kinds of things we were studying. It started to get dark, and Andreas mentioned his family had a house not too far from where we were, and that we could stop there for the night and sleep, since he was tired and didn't know if he could drive us all the way to where we needed to go. We all kind of looked around at each other, but ultimately agreed that it was rude to expect this nice man who picked us up to drive us all through the night. Yes, Andreas was nice, but driving up the dirt road to his house made all of the hairs on my arms stand up. I would later ask my companions, and they said the same thing. All of us got silent as we tried to take in the scenery. It looked like any Eastern European house set far back on what used to be a farm, with all of the old abandoned equipment around. We unloaded and shuffled into his house, which was very quaint and charming. He showed us into a room off the living room that we could all sleep in for the night. We all set out our sleeping bags and kind of congregated on the floor while Andreas went into the kitchen. He started talking to his wife. "Honey, I've brought back some travelers again. They are all very nice. Some of them are American. Yes, of course, I was going to offer them some brandy." Which he did. He came back into the doorway of our room and offered us brandy. I passed, but the others accepted. He brought us out a tray and the rest of the bottle, and then disappeared again. Eventually, we all drifted off to sleep. I woke up first, got dressed, and went outside to pee. I ran into a little girl on my way back up to the house. She was incredibly shy. I asked her what her name was and if she lived there too. She said she did, but she kept saying, "But my father doesn't believe me." I chalked it up to either my Hungarian being rusty or her being a kid, but I told her that she should come back inside because it was very cold out. She instead slunk back into an old mangled trailer she was playing in. Inside the house, I breezed past the kitchen with Andreas screaming out, "Why are there not enough eggs for our guests? What kind of wife are you?" But when I got back to the doorway of our room, all of my companions were standing up, bags hastily packed, mouths agape, looking behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw a scarecrow dressed up in women's clothing, sitting in an armchair at the far side of the living room. I turned back to my friends laughing and said, "You guys are afraid of a scarecrow?" But just then, Andreas came through the door, picked the scarecrow up by the arm, and flung it across the room. "You are the stupidest woman in the world," he howled. "I work so hard and you embarrass me." He went back into the kitchen still screaming and now rifling through the drawers. I turned to my friends and we all agreed that it was time to leave. Only the things Andreas was saying got worse. "I killed the last one. I can kill you too." We stood as a group, frozen. My friend Liddy turned around and saw a window, so we decided to jump through it to get out of the house. She was the first out the window, only when she landed, she made this weird squishing sound. My friend Janny popped his head out of the window and then started screeching and backing away from it. At this point, Andreas was stabbing the scarecrow with a huge knife, and we were all trying to just get the hell out of the house. The two of us still in the house pushed Janny out of the way, not really caring why he was screaming, because Andreas was holding a knife. Finally, I jumped out and landed in what I to this day pray was animal remains. Blood and guts, filling this deep trench next to this guy's house. There was also a lovely portrait of a family painted on the side of the house, using what looked like the blood from this giant hole. The four of us bloody, shaking, and still able to hear Andreas killing his scarecrow wife, hightailed it the hell out of there back to the main road. We decided against getting into another car and instead ran all the way back to our old car. We took a break from day tripping for a while.
This happened about 6 months ago. I was 22 at the time, and my daughter was only 4. I lived in a 2-story house with just me, my daughter, and my husband. I was taking at-home classes to be an iPhone specialist, starting at 5 p.m. and ending at 10 p.m., Monday through Friday. My husband had left for his 2 weeks of training he does every year for the military, so it was just me, my daughter, and our pit bull mix, Mavis. I had just finished my classes for the week and had the weekend free, so I decided to go to my mother's house until Sunday. so I packed up my stuff and my daughter's stuff and we went for the weekend. We returned home Sunday to find someone had broken into our home. There are muddy footprints and windows open, but nothing was missing. I was going to call the police, but my sister's husband explained that the cops wouldn't do anything. Nothing happened that night, but the next day my mother came over to pick my daughter up so I could do my classes without worrying what she was getting into. They left, and I went to watch the class upstairs. I put headphones on so I can hear my instructor teach the class, but swear I keep hearing stuff downstairs. I even texted my mom and told her I heard stuff downstairs, and it was creeping me out. But she assured me it was probably just Mavis because everything was locked up tight and no one could get in. I agreed, thinking I was probably just freaking myself out. I continued listening to my instructor teach, and I swear I heard footsteps on the stairs. So I hurry up and take my headset off and listen. I didn't hear anything. I walked down the stairs and didn't see anything either, so I went back to class. At 10 p.m. my class was over, and my mom decided to just keep my daughter for the night. I was doing my homework with Mavis upstairs with me, and all of a sudden she started barking and growling and ran downstairs. Now, Mavis usually barks and growls at the slightest noise outside, so I didn't think much of it, but decided I should check it out anyway because of what happened while I was at my mother's. Again, nothing out of the ordinary, so I went back upstairs. I was finally done with homework, and it's about midnight, so I went downstairs and called my mom like I do every night. We were talking, and I decided to open my daughter's door and peek my head in. I don't know why I did this because my daughter was at my mom's for the night. Just a habit, I guess. I should have mentioned earlier that when you look in my daughter's room, her bed is on the far wall a good ways away from the door, so you can clearly see under her bed. So I opened the door, and to my horror, a man was under her bed. I just froze and didn't move, just stood there in shock. After what felt like minutes, I slowly shut the door and whispered into the phone to my mom that there's a man in my house under my daughter's bed. My mom was terrified, and she screamed at me to get outside and to stay on the phone with her, and she had my brother call the police. So I ran outside with Mavis and waited for the police to arrive. After about 3 minutes, they came and searched my house and found no one, but they discovered my bathroom window was open, and they happened to shine their light at the living room window, and I could clearly see 2 huge handprints where they slid the window down. The cops waited for my mom and brother to get there, and while we're waiting, they told me about this man that usually stays 2 houses down from mine with his parents. Both of his parents have a pretty bad drug habit, and this guy has been known to put women in the hospital trying to kill them. What scares me even more is since we have bought this house, my daughter has been terrified and always told my mom she wanted to stay with her because it wasn't safe at mommy's house. I didn't think too much of it because I thought maybe it was just a new place, and you know how kids are with new places. After this whole thing happened, I stayed with my mom until my husband came home. We decided to ask our daughter about the house, and what she told me absolutely terrified me. She said that at night, while her dad and I sleep, monsters come to her window and try to get in. She said it was a boy monster and a girl. The next day, we installed alarms on all the windows and security lights. I can't stop questioning why. Why was this man under my daughter's bed? Was he waiting for me to go to sleep? Was he waiting for my mom to bring my daughter back home and I put her to bed? I get sick to my stomach thinking about what could have happened. It all began on a beautiful day at the beginning of autumn in 1998. I live in a small town called Gratham in Lincolnshire, United Kingdom. I was out with a couple of friends and it was coming up to the end of the summer holidays. I was at my friend's house when I decided to nip home to get a drink. My 2 friends walked down with me as it was only around the corner, a 5-minute walk to my house. I went in and they waited outside for me, or so I thought. While I was inside, I had a real thirst and drank about 3 pints of water before going back out to my friends. When I went back out, There was no sign of my friends. I looked up and down the street for them. Down the street, about 4 houses down from mine, there were a couple of large trees about 18 feet high overhanging the fence at the front. As I looked down, I saw 2 pairs of legs, as if 2 people were backed up in the tree, hiding. I automatically thought it was my friends messing around, so I started walking down, shouting that I could see them and to stop messing around. As I shouted to them, they sort of jumped over the fence where the trees were, a feat on its own really, came out on the other side of the trees and weirdly jumped over the next fence into the next door garden. I say weirdly as in the way they jumped. It was more like a dive rather than climbing. When they entered the next garden, they went to a gate at the side of the property, which was about 8 feet high, and proceeded to dive jump that too. I didn't understand how they had done that, but I still wasn't fazed by it and shouted again for them to stop messing around. Then I had an idea. I'd go down quickly and catch them when they come out of the next garden. I proceeded on to the next garden and couldn't believe what I was looking at. There in the garden stood 2 people. At first, they looked really odd. There was a man about 50 wearing a large trench coat that went down nearly to his feet. I could see he had large black boots on. As my eyes moved up, I saw his hands. They were very pale, and I noticed that his fingernails were very long, like claws, and they were really dirty, like a yellow color. Next, I saw his head. It was bald on top, and at the sides had long, black, greasy hair down to his shoulders. Its mouth was open enough to show sharp yellow teeth, and it had a large pointed nose. That's when I noticed the eyes. Jet black eyes that you would never believe if you hadn't seen them. I instantly froze on the spot. It felt like time froze. No one was around. Nothing moved. No wind. And all I could do was stare into its eyes, and I knew it was staring right back at me. I was aware of the other one near it. He was younger and dressed in more modern clothes of the time, as in trainers, popper trousers, a blue puffer jacket, and a baseball cap. I didn't see that one's face, as I was stuck staring into those deep, endless pits that were the eyes of the first thing. I will tell you now that I have never, ever felt so terrified in all my life. After what felt like hours, I managed to break the gaze and run home. When I got indoors, I cried my eyes out. I think it was the shock, the horror of knowing these things are wandering around in broad daylight. I never knew what they were until last night when I discovered the stories of black-eyed children. After reading some of the stories, I realized I was quite lucky that it wasn't a nighttime door visit, and I hope I never experience it again. Brandon and his fiancée recently moved out of this house that was kind of a trailer, but it had a long history behind the land and the house itself, even though the house was built for his wife Lily and her daughter Mallory. Lily had an eldest daughter who died very young. Her name was Jess. She was about 10 years old when she died. Her death was a result of a series of medical mishaps and illnesses that the doctor would not deal with until it was too late. I met Lily when I first went over to their house 3 or 4 years ago. That is when Lily and Mallory told me the story of Jess. We were cleaning out the shed and she found some things that really freaked me out. The first thing we found was a letter Jess wrote to her parents, Mallory, and all of her friends. It was pretty much predicting her death like she knew she was going to die. The next thing we found was a drawing of her family, but she wasn't in it, with a note saying, "This is my family when I leave." Kind of strange, right? It was dated a year before she died. Not to mention, the day before we found all of this would have been her 23rd birthday. Now on to even stranger things. I was sleeping over with Mallory and we were just hanging out in her room. It was late and it was already pretty creepy in the house. I always had a teddy bear with me back then. It was on the bed when Mal and I left for dinner. When I came back, it was in the closet, and the light in the closet was on when it was off before we left. There were many times I felt her presence in that house. So I started bringing toys with me for Jess to play with. We would hear giggles and tiny footsteps and occasionally see her dart from room to room, but in a weird shadowy form. She especially loved the kitchen. This next story isn't about Jess. It's about the land the house was built on. There's this house that is right next door to theirs, and it has quite a murderous history. In the 50s, a man and a woman lived there, and the man was having an affair. The wife caught him and was so angry she attacked him, but he shot and killed her. Now, legend has it that she still roams the property, and the property next to it. What's crazy is we see her walking around the house and outside. You can feel her anger, and she doesn't seem as though she notices that she's dead or anything. It's like she's stuck in that time. This next story I'm about to tell you is one I experienced only half of it all on my own. My boyfriend at the time, Joe, and I were staying over at Brandon and Lily's place because Brandon, Joe, and I were going on a business trip in Winston-Salem the next morning. I needed to use the restroom, so I went, and I instantly got the worst migraine ever. I got done and ran out of there, but then Brandon's cat spazzed out and ran in there and hissed and darted back out. I walked into the kitchen where everyone else was, and Brandon asked me,
"Are you okay?"
I told him, yeah, I just had a huge headache. Then suddenly, it went away. I told him, never mind, it's gone. Note, my brother has always been sensitive to the paranormal. He says to me,
"No wonder. You just had 2 orbs just fly out of your head."
I was already terrified, but that topped it. That night, Joe and I were in bed on my air mattress in the living room. That's when stuff hit the fan. I kept hearing growling and the sounds of Jess crying. I looked over by the kitchen table, and there was a dark shadow crunched underneath it. So I pushed the bed closer to Jessie's urn and turned on the light in the cabinet it was in. The shadow went away, but there was nothing under the table that could have made that shape. The cat decided to hop up onto the bed with us. He faced the table and hissed so loud it startled me, because I had never heard him hiss like that, except for earlier that night in the bathroom. Then the light turned on in the kitchen, and Brandon and Lily were still in bed. Mallory went to live with her dad, so it couldn't have been that. I was so terrified I couldn't get out of bed. Joe and I stayed up all night that night. I felt kind of safe with him with me. When we got back from the trip, it got worse. Joe wasn't with me then. I was just there alone in the living room. It was around 3 a.m. when it started. The giggling, the growling, then the sobbing. The thing wasn't under the table this time, though, but what I did see was a black mass floating across the ceiling. I tried to suck it up and sleep, but I felt it getting more and more powerful until I couldn't take it anymore. I called my mom and begged her to come get me. I didn't even want to go back into the house to get my stuff, but I had to. When I went back in there to get the air mattress, something was thrown at my head. I don't know what it was, but then I heard the growling again. I darted out of there and just sat on the porch and video called my friend Josh until my mom arrived. I didn't step foot in that house ever again. I'm 36 now, but the following happened to me when I was 19. A quick backstory is that I was, and still am, a volunteer firefighter in a small West Australian town in the southwest. In addition to the normal volunteer firefighter ins and outs of attending incidents, I was also involved in the sports side of the fire brigade. This comprised of individual and team events. The fire brigade you belonged to was your team, and across Western Australia there were about 30 such brigades, and between October and April we would travel and compete. We had traveled to Geraldton to compete in the state championships in 1999. I had, through hard work, won the Championship Fireman Award and was at the hosting fire brigades after the event celebration and was enjoying myself with my team drinking beer and socializing, which started around 5 p.m. While I admit I was pretty drunk, I was still traveling. There were a shitload of people, and a lot of my time was spent talking to officials, older members, and with friends catching up. So I had not really got my drink on yet. I needed to take a piss, so I just went around the corner and started to piss in the garden like I had a few times already. Every other bloke at the party was doing the same thing. When I got a phone call from an unknown number. Being away from the noise, I answered it, and I remember the guy asking for someone I didn't know, and ended the call after perhaps 10 or 15 seconds of, "Sorry, wrong number." I finished my piss and then went straight back to the party. When I returned, I was absolutely in shock. Everyone had disappeared and it was dead quiet. Every table and chair was neatly stacked, all the rubbish cleared, the lights off, and doors locked. There were no cars, and it was just dead quiet, with not a sound, it appeared, across the whole town. I was fucking confused. I took my phone out, and it was just after 4 a.m. What the fuck happened? I checked through my phone, and it showed literally dozens of missed calls and 30 or 40 text messages of people searching for me and looking for me. I called my mate and made it back to my hotel, and over the next few days confirmed with many people that I had been standing in a circle and excused myself to take a piss after receiving a phone call, and that was the last anyone saw of me that night. Where I pissed was where everyone was pissing, so it is impossible that I could have been there unnoticed, and a group of friends searched around for me, but I was gone. I still don't know the explanation. A couple of years back, I got in a terrible car accident. I was driving alone and driving down a long road on a hillside, sneezed, accelerated into a patch of dirt, and spun out. Next thing I know, everything slowed down, and I couldn't hear my music anymore. I heard a voice I knew, but couldn't place, tell me, "Don't worry, everything is going to be okay." I then felt my body relax, and was engulfed by a light with color that I cannot describe. I was no longer in my body. Someone, or something else was. I was somewhere else. I was with people who were no longer on this plane of existence. People I knew in this lifetime and others. I'm then gently placed back in my body. I open my eyes to the otherworldly light fading to normal earthly light. There was no pain, no fear, no sensation of something happened. I closed my eyes and fell asleep. I wake up strapped to a backboard with a neck brace on in the back of an ambulance. Thinking it's a dream, I fall asleep again, only to wake up in the same position. I hear people talking to me but can't make sense of the words. I am wheeled into a hospital with paramedics, nurses, and doctors surrounding me. I only understand some of their words. I go through all of their tests and get settled into a room. By this point, I can understand and respond to questions. After the tests and hours of waiting for answers, I was released from the hospital with a minor concussion, some bruising, and abrasions. I walked to my mom's car. The next day, I learned all of the details from various people. I learned from the police report I kept spinning and hitting the guardrail until my car lost momentum. I heard from the tow lot my car would never be roadworthy again, and whenever they see cars in the condition, they never get to speak to the drivers. I heard from my parents that I was completely unresponsive for more than an hour and was taken to a hospital that specialized in head trauma. They were told that I may never be the same. No one believed I was going to walk out of the hospital, let alone 7 hours after I was admitted. I've always known I've had something looking over me, but never knew how much they would risk for me. Throughout the days, we take our 2 dogs outside to their kennels so they can get out of the house for a while and run and play and such. These are not small dogs. One is a black lab husky mix, and the other one is a full-blooded Staffordshire Terrier, pit bull. The kennels are placed at the edge of the yard near the woods. The woods are big, large enough to take a day to go hiking through them. Lately, when it gets dark, the dogs seem on edge. They will bark and whine towards the house to come in. At first, I figured they just wanted to get back into the house, but now I'm thinking they're actually scared. 3 nights ago, when I went to get them, it was already dark, but we have a security light, so it wasn't pitch black or anything. I got to the front of the first kennel and noticed both dogs were being quiet. They always bark at me excitedly when I go to get them, but they were dead silent. This weirded me out a little, but not to the point of being scared. I will admit that there was a certain uneasiness in the air, though. Something that I can't explain, but it sort of felt electric, like I was about to be shocked. The longer I was there, the more uneasy I felt. I started getting the first dog, the lab, out, and heard a heavy snap in the woods near the kennels. I froze. The dogs froze. By this time, I was so on edge that if someone had spoken, I would have jumped, screamed, and possibly ran. The creepy feeling in the air just kept getting thicker. The lab had her bushy tail stuffed underneath her and was whining. This didn't make me feel any better. The pit bull was as far away from the woods as she could get, whimpering for me to come get her. I can only take one dog in at a time because they get too excited and will sometimes try to fight, so I avoid it at all costs. I felt so bad leaving the pitty there by herself, but I had to do it. As I walked away, she barked this high-pitched whining type of bark at me that I have never heard her do before. The lab couldn't get to the house quick enough. I went back for the other one and dreaded every step as her door is right at the base of the woods. I would have to turn my back to the woods to open her door and get her out. The air felt heavy and stale, with an unpleasant smell, like a dead skunk, as I approached the kennel. Another snap, and I was about ready to run for it, but I didn't want to leave my dog, who had her head down defensively facing the woods. I could barely make it. To be honest, it felt like trying to walk through water. I was terrified by the time I reached my door. I heard heavy breathing behind me as I got my dog out. She was scared too, but started growling behind me. I was frozen in place. The breathing continued for a minute before I heard steps coming towards us. We both took off at the same time. A terrifying scream came out of the base of the woods. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. My pity pulled me all the way back to the house. I got in, flipped off all the lights, and stared out the window at the woods. I could see something moving slightly, but just out of the light. It moved back and forth for about 5 minutes, then disappeared. It took me forever to fall asleep that night, because I was so scared that every little noise freaked me out. The next night I went to get the dogs earlier, right around dusk. I thought all was good until I was getting my pitty out. A huge snapping sound, like a tree branch had been snapped in half, rang out. It sounded pretty far away, so I just hurried up, got my dog, and started towards the house. A few steps away from the kennel, I heard something big start charging towards me from inside the woods. We ran again, and it appeared to follow for so long, then retreated back. Now, every night since then, I hear sounds coming out of the woods, like branches breaking and being thrown around, knocking on trees, and roaring. I am absolutely terrified. I no longer even take my dogs down. I just take them for walks during the day and make sure we are all in bed before dusk. I don't know what to do. I'm thinking about buying a gun, but I'm not sure it will help. To start this story off, and to give a little insight about me, I'm an 18-year-old female who grew up in Michigan, and have lived in the country for as long as I can remember. And for a heads up, this story is long, so bear with me. Now, back to the story. On one particular hot summer weekend, me and a couple of friends, including my boyfriend, let's call him Tony, and my older brother, let's call him Brad, decided we were going to go camping for the weekend since it was such a nice warm week. Tony's parents had owned a cabin way out in Ludington, surrounded by a huge wooded area with a personal lake and no neighbors for at least 4 miles. But being stupid teenagers, we didn't really think about all that. All we were ready for was to party like any normal teens would. Well, after being there for 2 hours, our fun had started. Tony's friends had brought tons of alcohol and weed to last us for the weekend, so we wouldn't be bored since we had no service and only movies to watch. After it got around 12 a.m. and was pitch black, we had a huge bonfire going. It was a total of 6 people, including me and Tony. As we talked and laughed about upcoming events in our lives, we were so distracted that we didn't notice that my brother had literally frozen his eyes to one section of the woods. Mind you, we were all intoxicated and high at the time. Eventually, our talking ceased when Tony realized his friend and my brother had emotionless expressions.
Hey dude, you alright?
He asked Brad. Silence. Brad didn't reply or even make any movements that would indicate he had heard him. After that, I started to get scared, as well as the other 2 girls there. It took a lot for my brother to act that way. Eventually, I was the first to catch on that he was excessively staring into a certain spot in the woods. I turned my head and followed his gaze the best I could. And when I finally caught on to what he was staring at, my heart dropped. There, right fucking there, was at first look a dog. At least that's what I thought. It was some person's dog that wandered off. But then my brain kicked in and I realized there wasn't any neighbors for miles. So how could there be a dog? My mind started to race while Tony still tried to get Brad to speak or even move. In one motion, this thing stood up tall. And when I say tall, I mean fucking gigantic. It had to be at least 6 feet tall. Everyone had seen it then. How could you not? The other 2 girls and the other boy with us gasped, and they finally grasped why my brother was standing so still. No one moved for what seemed like hours. Tony was the first to talk.
No tail,
he mumbled. No one heard what he had said but Brad. And I swear to you, I saw his eyes widen as big as pan saucers. That freaked me out immediately. What did you say? One of the other girls asked.
It has no fucking tail,
he hissed at her. My heartbeat stopped. He was right. There was no tail on this thing. Suddenly, my clouded alcohol mind cleared in a fraction of a second when I finally realized what this thing was. Now I understood why my brother was basically shitting his pants. This thing was a skinwalker. My instincts kicked in right then and there, but before I could nope the fuck out of there, the thing took off, leaving a terrible stench like rotting meat before screaming inhuman-like. The sound was enough to scare the fuck out of everyone. My brother was the first up out of his chair and started shouting native words to the creature, which is why I told everyone to get the fuck inside. No one questioned me when they had seen just how dead serious I was, especially Tony. He's never seen me so scared and he knew it was a bad situation. We all hightailed it into the cabin with my brother in tow, still shouting native words at the creature, which seemed to keep it at bay, while it gave us enough time to get inside. He slammed and locked the door before turning off all the lights and grabbing a special ash from the kitchen counters and started throwing it at every window and door while chanting. Of course he had everyone freaked out and basically in tears at that moment. After he was done, no one said a word for a long time, all of us still in shock. He grabbed our dad's pistol and had it posted by him for hours. Everyone was entirely too shaken up to even question what happened. We must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up to my brother packing all our stuff into the 2 cars early in the morning. I understood why. We had native family. We knew what we were dealing with, and we knew it would come back and maybe not alone. Before we left, I did a blessing on the cabin and spoke a few calming words to the still very freaked out girls. We left as soon as everything was packed up. To this day, we still haven't explained exactly to our friends what happened that night, and they never bothered to ask us either. During 1999, I worked briefly as a vacuum cleaner salesman. Yes, the job was as terrible as it sounds, which required very late nights as I was often at customers' homes till around 9 p.m., before having to go back to the head office to check in, then drive back home, often not arriving home till around 12 or 1 a.m. I was working late this one particular night and was on the home stretch, around 10 minutes from home, when my old crappy Ford Fiesta started to overheat. I knew the car wouldn't make it home and had no choice other than to pull into a lay on top of the big, dark, deserted mountain next to my town. My hometown is literally the last town before there are just mountains and forests for countless miles. As I pulled into the mountain parking area with steam pouring out of my engine, this is 100% true, by the way, a white humanoid figure, obviously surprised that a car was pulling into a deserted parking space in the middle of the night, ran directly in front of my headlights as it sprinted from the edge of the clear side of the parking area and into the forest on the other side. It had no clothes, features, genitals, and hair, etc. Just a white figure with 2 arms and 2 legs that appeared almost luminous and reflective in my lights. To say I shit myself is a bit of an understatement. My eyes popped out of my sockets when it ran in front of me, but then I realized that I was stuck in a dead car in a deserted mountain lay in the middle of the night with no mobile phone signal. This was back in the days when mobile phones were just starting to become popular, and large chunks of the country were missing from network coverages. I had no choice but to sit there for an hour until my car cooled down, as it gave up the ghost pretty much the second I pulled in. So I sat in my car, alone, staring directly into the forest where the thing I saw had run. No weapon, no way to contact anybody to let them know where I was, and no passing traffic to possibly flag down. I knew for a fact that I had actually seen something, and it was not a trick of the light. That much was clear. I discounted sheep, horses, foxes, or any other animal that populated the Welsh mountains, as I was certain it was a 2-legged humanoid. It had a roughly human head, body, arms, and leg proportions. The obvious answer would have been it was some very strange man who for some reason was wearing a white entire body stocking. Think Charlie's Green Man from It's Always Sunny. But since we were miles away from the nearest home, and I was the only car around, it's highly unlikely that someone would have spent hours walking through thick forests just to hang out in a parking area in the middle of the forest wearing a unitard. Since I could rule out possible humans or animals, I had to consider the alternative, which isn't a nice thing to think about when you are stuck in a broken-down car with a creature very possibly still outside. I didn't think it was aliens, as it was too tall compared to the classic look, while any type of apparition or ghost doesn't tend to run away from people when surprised. I'm not sure if there is some kind of Welsh version of a goat man, but if I had to categorize the encounter, this would be my number 1 choice. There was always talk of satanic rituals and witches practicing in the forest when I was a kid, and also of illegal bare-knuckle fights where people had been killed and buried there to cover up the crime. But I didn't think much of it at the time, and always wrote it off to superstition and rumor. But now, I'm not so sure. Eventually, my car cooled down enough for me to limp back home. No one really believed me when I told them what I saw, and are adamant that it was a sheep. But to this day, I swear that the creature I encountered was something different. I've been in the forest many times since then, camping, biking, and hiking, and have never seen anything like that again. But whenever I go there, I am always aware of the possible presence of the Goat Man.
A few years ago, My brother-in-law bought another apartment complex in Florida. He owns a few apartment complexes in West Palm Beach and Miami. So when he told me he bought another one and wanted me to manage it, I figured, why the hell not? I had just graduated college with my degree and planned to go out and get a master's, so I figured I could manage his place and do graduate school. When he booked my flight to Orlando, I was stoked. Hell yes. I love Disney and I dreamed about buying a year pass and checking out all the neat parks. Then when I got there, we drove out to Orlando and I had a bad feeling. He bought the apartment in a town called Leesburg. It's only about an hour from Orlando. It's if a biker town and a retirement community had a baby. I was a little disappointed that I was an hour from Orlando, with its nightlife and clubs and whatnot. I made it work though and soon started to settle into life managing the small apartment complex. I had my own one-bedroom apartment in the corner, and then there were 10 other tenants. Most were older folks, snowbirds and retirees that spent their days golfing and swimming in the pool we had. There were 2 military families, one with small kids, and then there was Andy. Andy was an enormous man. I'm a pretty big guy, 6 foot and around 250 pounds, and he was at least 6'6" and 400 plus pounds. He walked with a cane and had long black hair which he put into a ponytail. He worked from home, or so he said, but rumour was that he was on disability after a horrific work accident. I didn't really care though. He paid his rent on time and he was quiet and kept to himself. I was only in this place once when his AC cut out, and to my surprise, found out that he was pretty neat. No food containers or pizza boxes or beer cans, etc. I expected a big guy like him to have things laid out. Things in our complex were pretty good for the next year, until one night in November. It was raining like it always does in Florida, and it was about midnight when someone rang my doorbell. I looked out and saw one of my tenants, Joseph. Joe was one of my retirees who retired to Florida to, in his words, play golf and drink beer. Normally he was all smiles and jokes, but that night his face was pale and he looked frightened. "I hate to bother you, Sam, but something isn't right with Andy," he said. I put my jacket on and followed him to his apartment, since Andy was his neighbour. He put his finger to his lip and motioned for me to listen. I put my ear up to the door and heard Andy fighting with someone. It sounded like whoever he was fighting with was also throwing things. I was taken aback, as he never had a guest over since the year I'd known him and that he'd lived there. So I knocked, and I heard him stomp over to the door and open it. Normally, he was very well dressed, put together, and like I said, he wasn't a messy guy, but he answered it in a t-shirt that had grease stains. His hair was limp and greasy, and he reeked of BO. I peered behind him and saw that his place was a disaster. I asked him if everything was okay. He was irritated and told me that it was and pretty much shut the door in my face. I sent Joe back to his place and told him to let me know if he heard anything else, and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to pay Andy a visit to see if he was okay, and I went to his place and knocked. No answer. So I decided I would try again later. But I got busy doing other things and then forgot all about it. So December rolls around, and I am in starting to get the monthly rent checks. But there's none from Andy. That got me a bit worried as he was always on time with his checks. So I knocked on his door. Nothing. I knocked again and I heard the guy grunting and moaning. Now, I should have called the police first, but I didn't. I opened the door with my keyring and was hit with the foulest smell ever. It smelled like shit, piss, vomit and BO rolled into one nasty smell. The walls were streaked with what I could assume was shit, and the place was trashed. I started to call Andy whilst dialing 911. and I heard the moaning from the back room. What I saw that day, I can never unsee. I sometimes still get flashbacks. Andy was naked and laying on the floor of his room on some dirty clothes. He was covered in his own shit and piss, and there was piles of vomit on the carpet. But what was worse is that he was covered in bites. Human bites all over his arms and legs, and they were starting to smell with infection. He was also bleeding from his rectum, and I wondered who attacked him. Was it the woman we heard him fighting with? I didn't get my answer until a few days later. He had to be rushed to the hospital and was fighting for his life in the ICU. The doctors spoke to his sister, who turned out to be his medical guardian. And things slowly came into place. Turns out Andy did that to himself. He suffered from multiple mental disorders. He stopped taking his meds the month before November. There was no other person that night. He was arguing with himself. Those bites, he infected himself. The bleeding from his rectum was from inserting a foreign object in there and doing so much damage it ruptured his internal organs. He ended up pulling through and went back home to live with his sister. I had the task of cleaning the apartment, and what I found whilst cleaning pretty much freaks me out, the same as finding him. He had a shoebox full of cutouts from magazines, old family photos, and even photos he obviously took of the residents of the apartments, including myself. All of the eyes were burnt out with cigarettes, and on some of them, X's were put over the mouths. I'm not sure if that was part of his mental decline, or if he was always that creepy and I just never noticed it. All I can hope for you, Andy, is that you got the help you needed, and are feeling better. I travel pretty regularly, so I don't struggle with anxiety nor anything about flying. I really quite enjoy it. That being said, Flight 72 from New York City to Istanbul in 2012 was easily the scariest experience of my life. We departed from JFK early evening. I wanted to say about 5 or 6, and it was a 10.5-hour flight. A couple of things as background. My plan was to eat the provided dinner, wait a little bit, take the sleeping pills I'd bought, and pass out. And hopefully, wake up an hour before landing and avoid all the monotony that goes along with long flights. The other thing to note was that this was not a nice plane. It looked old, it felt old, and rickety, and had that old plane smell. Okay, so everything was going to plan. We were about 3 to 4 hours into the flight. I'd eaten dinner, taken my pills, and was just starting to fade out, when I noticed 2 things. 1. The screens throughout the cabin that depicted the flight path and our current location were off. Last I looked, it had shown us ways off on the coast near the middle of the Atlantic, and it felt like we were periodically dropping altitude. It was odd, because it felt controlled, and it wasn't a big constant drop. Just every few minutes, you could sense that we were being lowered bit by bit, leveling off. This sort of piqued my interest enough to shake off the drowsiness that was coming on. But I wasn't really nervous at this point, just curious as to what was going on. I don't think many people on the plane had any idea about anything unusual. That wasn't until we heard over the intercom, "We need to make an unscheduled landing. Flight attendant, prepare the cabin." That got people's attention. Obviously, my first thought was, unscheduled landing? Where? We're in the middle of the Atlantic. I was sitting in the middle of the cabin in the 767 we're in, near where the flight attendant station is, and the jumper seats they sit in, so it was easy for me to lean over and try and chat with one of them. I asked if they had any more information. I knew where we were going to land or what was going on, to which the 2 flight attendants replied that they didn't have any more information than we did at that point. So this sort of quiet anxiety now exists within the cabin. People are chatting quietly between themselves, and everyone is looking around out the windows. It was a clear night, and we were over the Atlantic. All you could see was the ocean. Meanwhile, the screens are still dark, and we are continuing this sort of periodic descent. 10 minutes pass. The captain comes on, and essentially repeats the same message. Still no more information from the flight attendants, and this 10-minute pattern of repeating the same message and the weird descent, with still only the Atlantic to be seen out the window, goes on for another 50 minutes. I had no idea what to assume about all of this. Even the flight attendants seemed anxious, and I even specifically asked them if it was an emergency landing, if the plane was malfunctioning, and they wouldn't confirm or deny anything to me. Let me say here, the flight attendants were phenomenal this whole process, very patient and helpful, and they legitimately did not have the answers we were looking for, and did a wonderful job of keeping everyone calm. That being said, the pilot gets on the line and repeats the message and says we're making an emergency landing. This time, sooner than the 10-minute pattern than before. At this point, we couldn't have been more than a few thousand feet above the Atlantic, as our descent had continued this whole time. I didn't have the perspective to see forward, obviously, but on both sides of the plane, all I could see was ocean. There was a palpable anxiety in the cabin, including myself. I always wondered how much that sleeping pill I took helped calm me down, with how high my adrenaline level was. It certainly wasn't helping me sleep at this point. We were getting closer and closer to the ocean, like we were going to land almost. My heart was thumping in my chest. I even got my phone out and was drafting a text to my wife to tell her that I loved her, on the small chance that it would somehow send. Not sure what I was thinking. At the very last moment though, nearing the ground, I see the small light of some fishing boat, and then some lights from land, as then we touch down, on land. Everyone clapped and yelled in joy, and let out a huge corporate sigh of relief. The pilot got on, and says that there was a malfunction with the plane, and that we had made an emergency landing in Newfoundland in a tiny island called Stevensville. I came to find out later that there had been an electrical malfunction in the cockpit, and that the instrumentation for the pilot was either inaccurate, or not on at all, but that he was essentially flying the plane with very limited instrumentation, essentially manual or flying blind. This explains the weird descent pattern that he was doing, bit by bit, as they tried to figure out where to land. The malfunction happened over the Atlantic, and he had the choice between trying to make it to Iceland or turning back and trying Newfoundland, and choosing the latter. I learned that generally, they try to plan flight paths across the Atlantic in a sort of arc, in case of situations like this, so the pilot has options. In this case, I'm certainly glad he did. I had a chance to talk to the pilot later on in the evening, but he wouldn't go into much detail about what happened. But I assumed he would have just told me that this was a routine kind of thing. A seasoned pilot probably saved a lot of lives that day, including mine. Beyond all that, what happened over the next 8 to 10 hours is another crazy story. But still, that time with those crazy descents was some of the worst and most terrifying times of my life, and I'm so glad I made it out alive. So I grew up as a middle-class suburban dweeb. Middle son in a waspy family in a mostly stable home. Like many such children, I was left to my own devices quite a bit. When the first modem made its way into the house, along with AOL, I was hooked on the chat rooms. That was a pretty momentous occasion for me. Let me explain. I was a sexually precarious child. Before my teens, I was already desperate for it, despite not knowing what it actually meant. There wasn't really an outlet for it though, so it mostly meant me spending huge amounts of time alone in the room, thinking abstractly about the topic. When chat rooms became available, I entered the equation, because it gave me a wealth of people to talk about the topic with, and I was basically addicted. I would lurk in sexually explicit chat rooms for hours on end. After years of being a lurker, casually observing the discourse in the chat rooms, I started participating. Being the internet, it was mostly men, but I was crazed, and there was attention. I began to have pretty lucid chats, leading to cybersex. That was the days before the proliferation of digital cameras, or even scanners, so it was strictly text. I went on for a little while. In the generic hookup style chat rooms, I'd cyber with anyone who came my way. When they'd inevitably ask for my location, I'd give a suburb about 30 or 40 minutes away from where I really was. Until one day, I remember very clearly I'd been cybering with one guy in his late teens, only a handful of years older than me. When he asked where I lived, I lied, and returned the question to him. He replied that he lived in the suburb that I actually lived in. I confessed my lie, saying that I'd only lied to keep creepers away, and he commended me for the clever idea. And so it got to be that I'd cyber with this guy every couple of days. He'd ask me about phone sex, but I didn't want to get a call on my parents' line. Our sessions turned into discussions of what we would do if we met up. He said he knew the perfect place we could play in his car, and asked where a safe spot could be so that he could pick me up. I mentioned a park that was several blocks away. Things continued this way, strictly in the realm of fantasy for a while. Eventually, though, I started to lose interest. I wouldn't sign on for weeks at a time, then months, and then whenever I did, he would be there, ready to pick up where I left off. I was usually willing to oblige, because it was all just harmless idle fantasy. Years later, I'd all but forgotten about my account. We didn't have AOL anymore, and I'd made a newer account on my AIM. About 5 years after all of this had started, I was moving into my college dorm and setting up my new laptop, when I remembered my old handle and signed back in. It had been years since I'd last signed on. Surely enough, who IMs me first but my old friend. He asked me what I'm up to, and I tell him that I've moved. "Ah, shucks," he replies. "We never did meet up." "Yeah," I said. "Bummer." "It's a shame that date didn't work out." "What date?" I ask. "We were going to meet in Walgreens on your block, but you chickened out." I replied, "Oh, I don't think I remember that." I was racking my brains to recall such an event. There was in fact a Walgreens on my block, but it was relatively new. "We were going to meet in the parking lot, but you drove away before I could talk to you." I assured him he was mistaken, as I hadn't spoken to him since I'd gotten my license. "No man, for real, you were going to meet me in that black Ford Focus with the bike rack and the alien sticker on the back." The room seemed to swim. I felt like I was falling backwards. He correctly identified the car I was driving, but I'd never told him about it, nor mentioned the tiny details, nor sent him a picture that included my face. I'd never set anything up. Was he deliberately messing with me? Just trying to let me know that he'd found me? Or had the years since this happened twisted my mind? Had he convinced himself that him stalking me was a meeting we'd arranged? I blocked him and tried to forget about it. I wasn't living in the same town anymore, and even though his stalking prowess was apparently good, I was a significant distance away, and a pretty athletic guy. If he found me again, I didn't think I'd have much to worry about. I'd nearly forgotten about the whole thing until the other day. This was well over a decade later at this point. My older brother and I were catching up, lamenting getting older. I told him that there was an old member of my graduating class that had already gone to jail for a felony and served his time. This led to a discussion about friends, classmates and such who had been arrested. He led with, Remember Charles? I played football with him. He was arrested for sexing up kids he met online. Crazy! I looked up the case. He'd been tried and convicted for a slew of sex crimes. He had apparently been using the social sites like Xanga, MySpace and Friendster to meet young boys. He blackmailed and assaulted some of them when they wanted to break it off. The more I read, the more I got a heavy feeling in my stomach. I googled his AIM handle. It wasn't terribly unique. There were similar accounts named on all sorts of sites, which were definitely not him. But one, deeper in the results, was an account on a rollerblading forum. Skimming this account's post, I was positive it was the same person I'd been chatting with. Clicking the user profile statistics page, the last login was precisely the day before my brother's friend was arrested. At this point, I have more questions than answers. Could it really have been him? If it was it random chance? Did he know me through my brother? Is that how he was able to put a face to a name? Was he waiting in my neighborhood on purpose? Or was it coincidence? It's felt like years. Allow me to explain. It was a vivid summer day, and I had taken a short notice trip to Arizona, trying to find some relief from the tiresome sunshine state on the other side of the nation. I only decided to leave when I was hit with a rather heavy day at work. My boss decided to chew me out for running late, despite the massive car crash on the motorway. A customer yelled at me because they didn't know what a Gmail was. Yeah, because I can definitely control traffic. And yeah, I definitely want to explain to you what Gmail is. I hate working customer service, so I called in sick and caught a last-minute flight to Phoenix. Phoenix. Yeah, Phoenix. Nice and far away from the hell I called home. I wish I'd never decided to do that. Around 2 days into my trip, I decided to head up to Zion Canyon for some sightseeing. I had spent a lot of time around the Grand Canyon and figured I should set some time apart to check out other places in the area. Besides, I'd never been to Utah before. Maybe I would take a hike, that one trail I had already read upon. Angel's Landing looked dangerous, but it would be something incredible to experience, and certainly worth it if I made the summit. I turned on Google Maps, and my rather shitty Android fumbled around with it until finally it picked up the location. The voice of a robotic woman began to speak. It was the damn GPS lady. She guided me through several backwater roads with twists and turns and roundabouts, until she stopped with a final sentence. Head on Highway 89. Continue straight for 184 miles. Alright, seemed easy enough. As I finally approached the highway, I was absolutely in awe by the view. No more buildings remained, only the wild, barren landscape of the southwest. Mountains peaked in the distance, covered by desert shrubs. Old trailers and abandoned houses dotted the landscape. Everything was so beautiful compared to the constant headache that was Florida. My eyes soaked up the desert views, relieved that for once it wasn't just endless miles of swampland. I felt so isolated. I was free from civilization for miles. But something was wrong. The desert didn't feel real to me. The sun was too bright, the mountains too still, and the sky too blue. The whole landscape seemed too picturesque, as if it were straight out of a postcard. It felt as though it were all a facade to drag me into something, and it was not unlike something straight out of a fever dream. You know those mornings as a kid when you wake up with a pounding headache and sense of false reality? I'd been driving for hours, and the scenery just seemed to remain stagnant. I was so sure I'd spent the entire damn day on the road, but the sun hadn't moved an inch. Was I hallucinating? God, when was this road ever going to end? Speaking of it, I'm still here. I've been driving on this road every day. It only keeps on going and going. I've been seeing the same road signs over and over. There's no civilization around. I've tried knocking on those trailer doors, but no one's ever home. And you know what else? Despite my solitude, I feel like I'm constantly being chased. I hate that feeling. That same feeling from when you're a kid and you sprint up the stairs from the pinch of darkness down, not daring to look back at whatever was behind you. That feeling when any source of noise of your house was enough to make you jump and run for your life. The source of the noise for me was the booming. And that feeling is always here. Every once in a while I hear a booming, as if someone is going at it with a gigantic drum. I slow my car down, and the booming gets faster, closer and louder. And that feeling, every time I slow, the feeling grows stronger, as if whatever it was is getting closer. It's like whatever that something is hunting me down, almost testing me, and every time I stop the booming gets louder, as if it's targeting me. I don't know what that is, but I feel like it's dangerous. I don't know what chases behind me, but I know better than the kid who runs away from his basement door the first chance he gets. Running away from that something, but that something is behind me. I don't know what it is, but it's got me trapped right where it wants me to be, and I can't get out. I've driven off cliffs and into rivers, yet I wake up on the side of the road again, to the same sight, my truck waiting for me to drive off again. I can't even commit suicide. The place won't let me. I've tried communicating through whatever internet I could scrounge up on my phone, but I don't even know if anyone has seen my cries for help. The screen just shows up blank, save for my own words written in desperation. No one will ever answer my texts. No one will answer my calls. I will never see any other cars. Only me. I never get hungry, or tired, or thirsty. Only trapped. It's like time hasn't passed. Time hasn't passed. Everyone is gone. Something's chasing me, and I'm still writing this. I think I've been in the same spot for too long. The boom's only getting louder, and now something is right behind me. Time has not passed, and I need to get out. Now. I don't like to tell people about my life and the things I've experienced because I have anxiety, especially related to interacting with other people. I've only told this to a few people outside my immediate family, and I've only recently just started talking about it. I wish I'd told someone sooner, as I discovered a co-worker encountered these men as well. But talking about it now does seem therapeutic. Anyway, this is my story. I worked downtown, standard 8 AM to 5 PM work shift. Once in a while I worked overtime, but not often, and not on the day that this happened. It was just a couple of minutes after 5 PM when I left work. It's just a few blocks from my office building to the train station. There are a few bars and back alleys along the walk, but the worst I've ever dealt with are a few homeless folk who get a little aggressive asking for cash. They don't bother me much. The train ride from the station to downtown, where I park my car, is about 40 minutes. If I'm lucky, I manage to get a seat and don't have to spend the whole ride standing. On that day I was lucky, more or less. I got a seat next to a window, which left the seat next to mine open. At the next stop, 3 men got in. One of them sat next to me, and the others sat from the seat across, so that they were facing me. I was listening to music on my iPod, so I couldn't really hear them. However, I did notice that the guy sitting next to me was trying to move closer to me on the seat. He would move close enough so that his leg was touching mine, so I'd scoot away, and then he would move closer again. Eventually I was pressed right against the window, and had no doubt that he had more than a few inches of free space on his side. I was wearing sunglasses, and could surreptitiously glance at them. I'd noticed that they would occasionally say something, and then look at me. It was incredibly creepy and uncomfortable. I was nervous about getting off at my stop, but mine is the second to last on the train line. So when the train pulled into my station, I got off. The guy sitting next to me tried to grab my arm, but I was moving away and quickly was able to get out. I was hoping they wouldn't get off the train there. It was a busy station, and they couldn't have known where I was parked. But they did. I guess it was their luck that they targeted me. I park in the furthest lot from the station because the parking there is free. It's about a 7-minute walk, which isn't usually too bad. But my lot tends to be pretty quiet, and I was really worried that these guys were following me. A bit of background. I was fat. I worked in an office job and was sitting down all day and not working out. Add that to my strong sweet tooth, and you've got a recipe for a bad body. I was about 30 pounds overweight, and probably couldn't run more than 30 seconds. Sad, considering that I ran track and played hockey in high school. I still play hockey, but on a women's day league, and it's not really that competitive. I'm the youngest on my team, about 20 years old, but my mum is on the team and it's something that we do for fun together. I was crossing the bridge over the road from the station to the parking lot when I noticed the 3 guys less than 10 feet behind me. I wasn't carrying a knife, although I do own a legal sized knife, nor any pepper spray because it's illegal in my Canadian city. I know a little bit about personal protection though, a required class for girls at my private high school that I attended in my youth. So I put my house key between my fingers if I needed to hit someone with it, because it would hurt them at least a little bit. The guys followed me across the main lot. They didn't hide the fact that they were there, and the more nervous I was, the louder they laughed. I managed to get across the road between the lots before they got to the road. They had to wait for a couple of cars to pass before they could cross. I was almost halfway across the lot when they crossed the road, and I started to run. I could hear their feet pounding the pavement behind me. I used my clicker to unlock the car when I was close, and I wrenched the door open. I'm so glad that there was no one parked next to me. I had barely closed my door and slammed the lock when the guy reached for my car. They were banging on the window and yelling, jeering. I'd never been so afraid in my life. I was worried they'd break the window and get in. There was a guy in the back, banging the back of my hatchback so I couldn't reverse out my spot without running him over. I should have, but I was afraid and not thinking. I was screaming, but no one was around to hear me. I don't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't anything good. I wished I had the screamer my mum had given me for protection, but it needed a new battery, so I didn't bring it along with me. That thought, the one about the screamer, made me realize I had something even better. When you're being assaulted, you're not supposed to scream for help. No one wants to help you. You scream fire, because everyone wants to watch the blaze. So I turned on my car alarm. It was incredibly loud in my car. So loud I thought I would go deaf, but it got the reaction I wanted. The guy started backing off. I saw people walking into the lot, looking into the direction of my car. People could see what was going on. The guys took off back towards the train station, and I drove home crying. The next night I started working out. I have worked out almost every day since then. If those cars hadn't been on the road at that time, if I'd have run just a little slower, if I had been too slow in clicking the lock, it could have all ended very differently. I've lost 20 pounds since then, and have gained a great amount of muscle. I quit my job. I've had anxiety issues for years, and this encounter made it so much worse. I never want to feel powerless again. It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog Lucy barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter, staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there, rummaging around. I thought she was just freaking out over a house noise. We'd only had her for 3 months, and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best thing to do would be to open the door and show her that nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but that's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured that it would work with a puppy too. I opened the door, and she raced to the front door. She stood there snarling. It was an angry, violent growl, one I had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her that everything was okay. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumped towards me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered, almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerisms changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. Outside were 2 kids. One was only just a smidgen shorter than I, and didn't look much younger. I'm 21, and she looked to be around 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde, and she wore it long, about mid-back with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking, olive-coloured pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a small girl who looked to be around the age of 4 or 5 in the same style jeans and a button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one looked at the floor shyly, but had the same shade of hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one my daughter has, as was the style of dress. Had it not been for the feeling of overwhelming dread and fear, I probably would have asked these children to come in, as well as given them a hot beverage to get them out of the bitter cold. Something about them seemed off. At this point I hadn't made any noise. I hadn't hushed the dog or grumbled. Nothing. I hadn't turned on any lights. Those kids had no indicators that I was at the door. And yet, the older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and accentless. She held her head tilted downwards, and I could see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know that I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that's when I saw her eyes. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black, or midnight blue, or a dark, dark purple. But nonetheless, they were otherworldly. She said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who has always been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I have never been one to believe in these things, as a staunch atheist and skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I had written off many a ghost stories from family members and friends, eager to tell their tale. I didn't believe. Still, I could not rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and a black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently I backed away from the door, Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us in and use your phone." I took another step back, and with that step the tone changed. At first she seemed polite, but when I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have already broken in. Now, I'll ask you again. May we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door. I inched backwards, though something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back towards the door. It wasn't a physical pulling, so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I went into my room, covered up the window and locked the door, and sat in the dim light of the nightlight. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about the BEK that they don't come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I fear that I would have been the exception. But this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread when my house is silent at night, this fear of a knock at the door, tells me otherwise.
This happened to me last night. I live in a sketchy neighborhood in an old house with 2 other roommates. One of my roommates was at work that night, and the other was with her boyfriend, so I was home alone. Normally I stay up until about 2 or 3 a.m., but because I hadn't slept well the night before this happened, I crashed around 12 a.m. Since our house is old, it has a few defects. One of them is the front door, which jams when it's locked and it takes forever to unjam once it's unlocked. To avoid this, we just don't lock the door. This is clearly a stupid practice, but my roommate, who has lived in this house for 5 years, claims to have never had a problem with anybody breaking in. At about 2 a.m., I woke up and noticed a silhouette standing about 2 feet away from my bed. It appeared to be a man, about 6 feet tall, wearing a hoodie, and he was holding his cell phone towards me with the flashlight on. My sleep-fogged brain tried to rationalize what the heck was going on. At first I thought maybe my roommate and her boyfriend had come home and needed something from me, so I just said, "Hello?" and then remembered that my roommate's boyfriend was shorter and more slender. It finally dawned on me that this person obviously wasn't supposed to be in my house, and I started asking, "Who are you?" The man remained where he was, still watching me and taking pictures or recording me or whatever the hell he was doing with his phone. I asked him again and started getting up. The man turned around and briskly walked out of my room, and I heard the front door close behind him as I tried to follow him. By now I was fully awake and freaking out. I frantically called my best friend Melody and told her what happened, and she called the cops while I was on the phone with her. The cops came and took some fingerprints but couldn't really go looking for the guy since I didn't have a very good description of him. They told me to call them if anything else happened, and then they left. I didn't sleep the rest of the night.
I recently moved into a big house, just temporarily. It's kind of a complicated situation. The house belongs to a family member. They were going to be gone for a few months, that sort of thing. I was going to be there on my own, so obviously I thought, what if it's haunted? There wasn't anything in the house when I moved in. There is now. I was in the main hallway unpacking some stuff when the doorbell rang. That put me on edge right away because the house is at the end of a long driveway and kind of out of the way. You have to go looking for it. There was an old woman at the door. This was in broad daylight, but there was still something kind of off about her. She was really tall, like a full head taller than me, and I thought there was something weird about the way she looked. It was like none of her clothes fit her properly. She took my hand and smiled really wide and told me that she was from the neighborhood council or something like that, and asked if she could come in and talk to me. My gut reaction was to say no, but I couldn't really think of a reason to. She was just an old woman. What was she going to do? I really wish I had just slammed the door in her face. I brought her into the living room, and she sort of tottered behind me, like her feet didn't fit into her shoes properly. She sat down without asking and grinned at me until I took a seat across from her. For about a half a minute, she didn't say anything, just smiled and stared at me while it got increasingly awkward. Just as I was about to break the silence, she fished in her pocket and pulled out this really big, old-fashioned sweet, the type that comes in that see-through wrapping.
"Here,"
she said.
"Eat this."
I should probably point out here that she spoke really quietly, so it was difficult to hear anything she said. I accepted the sweet, kind of taken back, and unwrapped it. It was dark red, almost black. I popped it in my mouth because she was still grinning at me and nodding her head. Have you ever walked around behind a supermarket where they keep the big bins? They throw meat that's gone bad in those bins. Imagine that rancid smell, but on a hot summer day. It's so thick you can almost feel it in the air. That's what this sweet tasted like. I almost spit it out onto the floor, but wanting to be nice made me chew the thing and force it down my throat. The woman was talking all the time, but between the taste and her quiet voice, I barely heard her. My mouth tasted like rotten meat, so I politely told her I was going to go get some water and ran into the kitchen. When I came back, she was gone. I had been in the kitchen for less than 30 seconds. My first reaction probably should have been to assume that she went to the bathroom or had to leave in a hurry. Instead, I searched the entire house. I went through every single room, convinced I was going to open a closet or look under a bed and see her stuffed in there, grinning at me. That didn't happen, obviously, but I was still extremely on edge as the sun started to go down. I felt like I was turning off the light in my bedroom after spotting a giant spider in there. That night, I propped a chair against my bedroom door because I just couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still in the house somewhere, hiding. I woke up at around 2 in the morning and heard creaking floorboards downstairs. It was an old house and unfamiliar. I kept telling myself that until the noises stopped. When I woke up the next morning, there was a red sweet on the living room table. I'll tell you the same thing I told the police. No, I can't be absolutely certain that the sweet wasn't there the day before. Maybe I had just overlooked it, but I didn't think so. They told me that the organization the woman claimed to come from didn't actually exist, and clearly thought I was wasting their time. After they left, I searched the entire house again, and then the grounds. Then I searched them again. By the time I was finished, I had managed to calm down a bit and looked at the situation rationally. The woman probably left the suite there the previous day, and I just didn't notice. I had searched the whole house twice now. There was nowhere she could possibly be hiding. She was probably just some doddery old lady who wandered off while I was in the kitchen. As I prepared to go to bed, I had managed to fully delude myself into thinking nothing strange was going on. I decided not to do anything childish like blocking my door, because what was I afraid of? Even if she somehow was still inside the house somewhere, what was she going to do? At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly, knowing in the back of my mind that something was wrong. I guess I must have heard something in my sleep. I turned over onto my side and reached out to turn on the bedside lamp, groping around because I was in an unfamiliar room. When the light came on, I saw the old woman standing right next to my bed. I only got a glimpse of her because as soon as I screamed, she scuttled backward out of the door really fast. I only got the briefest glimpse of her before she vanished into the unlit hallway outside my door. I now believe that the human brain has a special compartment for dealing with experiences far outside of the realm of the natural. If I had woken up to find a burglar in my room, I probably would have gone numb with panic. If there was a lion at the foot of my bed, I would have been too paralyzed with fear to do anything. But as soon as the woman was gone, that special compartment took over. I jumped out of bed and slammed the door shut, then shoved a chair up against the handle, and then dashed for my phone. No signal, no internet. I later found out there was nothing wrong with the phone or the local service. I think that she was interfering with it somehow. The drop from the bedroom window wasn't too high. If I landed just right, I would probably avoid injury. But what if I sprained an ankle or broke my leg? I had a sudden vision of pulling myself across the dark garden while the woman sprinted after me, and decided I didn't want to risk it. That gave me two options: wait out the night in my bedroom, or try to get out of the house now. I went for the second one. I was thinking that my flimsy barricade wouldn't hold if the woman decided she wanted back in. I broke one of the chair legs off and crept slowly into the hallway, reaching carefully for the light switch. When I pressed it, the lights came on for a second and then faded out. I flicked the switch a few more times. Nothing. Some gut instinct told me she was sabotaging them somehow. I used my phone for light as I slowly, quietly crept along the upstairs hallway and down the stairs. The light barely traced the shapes of the walls and the dark, yawning frames of open doorways. I jumped at every single shadow and unidentifiable shape, certain that at any second that grinning face would appear out of the shadows. I got downstairs and to the front door. I had double locked it and put the chain in place. Just as I was reaching for the first lock, I heard rapid, uneven footsteps at the top of the stairs, approaching swiftly. I undid the first lock. A high-pitched shriek came from halfway down the stairs, and I screamed as I undid the second lock and wrenched the door open. It stuck fast. I had forgotten the chain. I glanced behind me and saw the tall, spindly shape of the woman half running, half falling down the stairs toward me, her head lolling backward and her mouth hanging open. I can't even remember getting the chain off. I might actually have just yanked the door open so hard I broke it. In any case, the last I saw of the woman was her face, inches away from me, as I slammed the door shut. I sprinted to the nearest house and eventually they called the police, possibly because I was half delirious with fear and babbling incoherently. The police once again failed to find anything unusual. It's been a week. I'm staying at a friend's place, sleeping with the lights on and the bedroom door barricaded. The house's real owners aren't back yet. I'm not sure what I'm going to tell them, but I have to stop them from going back there, somehow. This isn't a haunting. It's an infestation. I can't stop thinking about all of the holes in our defenses, the windows and doors left open, the strangers invited into our living rooms. I just hope to God It's the house that she wanted, and not me.